Welcome to Archaeodeath, Death and Memory from Past to Present, an exploration of the archaeology of mortality by Professor Howard Williams.
Hey Archaeodeathlings, in this video I want to talk about the controversial subject of how we visualise the dead on social media. Now this builds off a whole series of publications I've done, and I shall mention during the video, about the public archaeology of death, but there's very few pieces on the digital dimensions of the public archaeology of death, and I'll mention some of the other relevant reading, but I want to flag up at the start this edited collection that's open access online by myself and Lorna Jane Richardson, called Death in the Contemporary World, Perspectives from Public Archaeology. So that's available from a special issue 3 of the journal online AP, the Online Journal in Public Archaeology from 2018. So the question is, how do we responsibly share images of the dead online?
For me, as a mortuary archaeologist, I've long puzzled over this and agonised over it. When is it okay to show images of the dead? What images do we select and how? What images convey that is interpretation, our choice of selection, and the angles, the perspectives we choose to use to back up our arguments? And when we're dealing with broader audiences, when we're dealing with the public who may not be trained in our expertise, not aware of why we're using these images, it can cause serious offence, it can cause serious issues and debates and controversies in why we're doing what we're doing. Why are we visualising the dead, and why are we using images of ancient human remains, mortuary contexts? But this also, I should emphasise this very clearly, this also applies to gravestones, funerary architectures, church monuments, for example, cemeteries, cenotaphs, and other material cultures. Now, there's a specific subset of this debate. Most of the debate has focused on museum display. You can imagine that the most controversial area of engaging with this issue of how we visualise and image the dead is in museum context, where we're talking to the public. When is it okay to actually put on display human bones and body parts or whole bodies, and when is it okay to sort of do artist reconstructions? What are the ethics of that? What is the good practice? What are the bad practices of those traditions that we've inherited from the 19th century and before, of displaying the dead as evidence of our interactions, of our engagements? And there's a new dimension to that in the form of social media. Academics themselves are using social media, both in the field and in terms of sharing images that they've taken themselves, and sharing news reports and discussions that visualise the dead. And this is reaching everyone, potentially. Your audience could be potentially people of Native American or Aboriginal background for whom there are particular sensitivities and religious and social associations and political associations of those human remains. You might be reaching groups who are bereaved. You might be reaching groups who have religious and cultural connections to those remains, or you just might be, the choice of image may be hitting people in a particularly upsetting time in their lives, their own thoughts of perhaps suicide, their own thoughts of loss of loved ones. And so we have to be aware that when we're disseminating our mortuary archaeology beyond the academy, and particularly to our students, which are within the academy, but particularly beyond that to wider groups, we've got to be very sensitive and respectful of the fact that we may be hitting people at the wrong time, or hitting groups that have very deeply felt affinities to the particular images we're using, or in general human remains and mortuary subjects in general. So it needn't be a specific connection to that set of human remains, that archaeological site, but it may have manifestations or connections. So the question I've posed with this video of, is it okay, or how do we display the remains of the dead, image the remains of the dead, is rapidly evolving as a key area of debate amongst mortuary archaeologists of what we're doing. How do we explain what we're doing? How do we justify what we're doing? And how do we connect this to broader social engagements. We want to educate, we want to engage, we want to get our message out there about the importance of our work, salvaging human remains, the mortuary context that may be subject to destruction ahead of development, or by environmental processes, or because we're following key research questions. But we've also got to be aware, in doing so, we're up against some very key challenging questions about why we're doing that. And this is addressed most recently in a brand new book called Ethical Approaches to Human Remains, a Global Challenge for Bioarchaeology and Forensic Anthropology. And this co-edited book is presenting us a brand new 30 chapters, I think it is, a collection, is presenting us with the broader challenges of bioarchaeology, forensic anthropologists work with the dead in the field, in the lab, in the classroom, in social and digital context, social media and digital context. And there's one chapter by Dr. David Erickson, about the social media dimensions of this. Their particular focus is on human remains, although the book and the chapter does touch on, but doesn't really address, the broader mortuary field. So, you know, graves, cemeteries, memorials, cenotaphs and so on. They do mention war memorials as another potentially sensitive area of imaging on social media. But they're mainly looking at human remains. And so their interests are perhaps tighter in focus than mine. But David Erickson's chapter is a really useful introduction. And I would say that in many ways, my first answer to the question is that the question of whether we use images of the dead on social media very much relates to the broader ethical debates that we're having about mortuary archaeology, dealing with indigenous communities, dealing with stakeholder communities, and in particular dealing with the wider public, who may be both offended or shocked or upset or traumatized by our images, but also might require, who are our audience for education and scientific knowledge and the furtherance of our understanding of the human past and our human present. So we have those debates about who are the communities we need to be careful of dealing with, or survivor groups, stakeholder groups, archaeological publics of different kinds, but also the dead themselves. What rights do they have? As what did they want to happen to their remains versus what we think might be appropriate? And these are thorny and ongoing questions. And I would say that in many ways, all of those questions, that's my first point, all of those questions that we would think about in terms of the excavation process and showing respect and ethical practice, lab-based treatments, museum display, curation, all of those, which I talked about in previous videos to do with Archaeologists and the Dead, a co-edited book I did with Melanie Giles in 2016, bleed into, further into, explore into, extend into social media and imaging of the dead in those public realms. So at one level, all those same challenges apply. Would a bog body want to be visualised? Would a mummy want to be visualised? And in many ways, we're dealing with contexts where the dead person never chose their mode of disposal, may have not even been honoured in death. I mean, take an Egyptian mummy that may have been a high-status individual who was afforded a rich and elaborate funerary treatment that they may have been desired in life, may have planned their own funeral. And yet on the other side, someone like a bog body or an executed victim, or someone who becomes a saint but may have never been a saint in life or never known they were going to become a saint, their remains, they have been treated and curated in the fashions that they would have never visualised or expected or aspired to. And so we can never go with just what the dead may have or may not have wanted. And there's a lot of challenges there, what ethnic group they may have come from, or we think they came from, what religious beliefs they may or may not have held. But we also have to think about that and potential stakeholder or traditional descendant community aspirations. That's the bottom line, is that we have those same nest of challenges dealing with social media images as we do with everything else. We're not exempt. And in a paper I did with Alison Atkin back in, I think, 2015, we talked about the double standard, that archaeologists talk a lot about respect for displaying the dead in museums and in our publications, specialist publications, and yet there's a double standard, and we often then just spew these images on social media and share stories from science magazines or digital news outlets that have images of skeletons and remains without thinking about that consequence. And the other point we made back in 2015 is that there's no guidelines, and the David Erickson's recent chapter just underpins the same point. There still are no clear guidelines of what archaeologists should do online with their images. So my first point is we have the same set of nested problems and challenges. Now, what I would now say is that, let me just summarise some of the key points that David Erickson, and I should have said also Tim Thompson as co-author of this chapter, Professor Tim Thompson, sorry Tim, forgot to mention you at the beginning there, this chapter called Sharing is Not Always Caring, Social Media and the Dead. Now, they mention there's no guidelines, but they also talk about that we're in a rapidly changing environment. Not only in terms of our technology to record human remains in mortuary contexts, our 3D imaging in particular is allowing sort of digital prints, but also the 3D visualization online of not only the human individual body parts, whole skeletons, whole burial contexts, 3D architectures of mausolea and tombs. We're able to create these environments digitally and share them widely, as well as photographs, two-dimensional photographs. We can create 3D visualizations, replicas of these monuments and contexts and remains. So in addition to that changing technological context, we have the rise of social media, from Instagram and Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat and all the rest. I'm on TikTok now, of course, and YouTube. These are modes of dissemination and important for engagement, and yet they open up the potential of us reaching audiences way beyond those intended. And a lot of the outrage online is about people who generally didn't mean to, well, they meant to say what they said, but they didn't expect them to be received by a particular audience without context. And that's what applies to speech and comment, also applies to gesture of human living individuals, whether a particular rude gesture or a polite gesture, or the interactions can be read in so many ways between individuals in text and image. But it also applies to the display of the dead, the imaging of the dead. And so we're in a massive new world that we haven't really conceptualized and debated what this all means and how we deal with it. And there's potential for so much misuse. In a recent discussion online, the Conversation, Ellen Finn uses the example of the meme in, I think it was 2018, that went viral, joking about a new discovery of a skeleton crushed by a block from the Roman site of Herculaneum during the eruption of Vesuvius. And this went viral with lots of memes and lots of humour. And her take was that this is inappropriate, outrageous. There's other ways we should be thinking about these human remains rather than laughing at the dead. And I would agree, but I would also say that humour has a place in the way we engage with ancient funerary remains, whether it's representations of death, the dead, gravestones that may be funny, or human remains themselves. And yet, of course, we also have to be respectful. There's a potential to just turn the ancient dead into jokes. Fetishizing and commodifying. There's a treating human remains as art, as it has a potential of showing the beauty of human bodies and remains, and showing the aesthetics that people appreciate, also reflections on mortality, but it has the potential of fetishizing and in turn allowing the commodification of human remains. There is an active and global trade in human body parts, which I abhor and I'm shocked by, and I'm afraid, whether deliberately or not, archaeologists are part of that trade, not in the sense that we are participating in disseminating those remains, but that we are creating a context in which there's a legitimacy to the acquisition and display of human material. And I think that's something I waded in on Twitter, I think last year it was, where there was the auction of a collection of early Anglo-Saxon cemetery remains by Hansen auctioneers. And to promote that on social media, he was pushing out images of body parts with often ridiculous nicknames attached to them and misidentifications of funerary archaeological remains, artefacts, and saying, you can buy this in our forthcoming collection at a forthcoming auction. So this is a real serious problem. The auction houses, collectors are being given legitimacy by mortuary archaeology, that they feel they can do this and it's not going to be a problem. So we have that issue too, that as well as the potential of mockery, of disrespect, we have the issue of commodification and fetishization. And there's also an issue of privacy and intimacy, and the rise of selfie culture, meaning which everyone goes, oh, it's so outrageous, people want to take pictures of where they are and with things they're in. But when this extends to funerals and extends to ancient archaeological remains or dark heritage sites such as concentration camps, people rightly question the appropriateness of putting yourself into the composition with those remains. And I've got views on this that I've outlined in Archaeodeath blog posts that I think actually it's quite okay, because I think that it's about placemaking and connecting you to those subjects rather than it being about taking things away from the dead or necessarily disrespectful. A lot depends on context and pose, I think, but I think we shouldn't perhaps be too denouncing of that. But there are issues of privacy and intimacy, of the connection between the living and the dead set up by the selfie, or if not taken by you, taken of you with tombs or with grave context on display in museums. And I confess, I've done a few of these myself, and I stand by them because I think I contextualise them appropriately. And this comes to the next point that Eriksson and Thompson raise. And I repeat, I'm sorry I missed out Tim earlier. Is that it all depends on justification and contextualisation. Why are we taking the picture, and are we giving a context to it? And the challenge that Williams and Atkins 2015 set up is that the problem with social media is that so much is decontextualised. The image is floating free. And that's not an excuse. People can see those images in abstract, but they should be able to follow back to a thread, to a context, a blog, when we use them. And if we don't actually properly contextualise and explain where these remains came from, were they legitimately and appropriately in collections, why are we showing these images, what are we hoping to convey, or are we just hoping to shock and offend, then it does become an issue. And Eriksson and Thompson make clear that they don't name names and shame anyone, but they do say that a small number of individuals, academics, it's not just random tourists going to sites and taking a picture, academics think they're being ethical, but actually they may be not being ethical in some of the things they do, and maybe I'm one of the people they're targeting there, I don't know. But there is an issue about, are we being ethical in how we display human remains, in image human remains. And linked to that, there's also they make the point that there are some people who just don't care, aren't even aware there's an issue, and they should be aware of the issue if they're working with human remains. So that's to give you a sketch of their approach to the problem, and they have solutions. They say a lot of it depends very much on making sure that we have permission, we show respect, we have justification, and education should be the underlying, as with medical samples, medical experiments. If we're not educating, if we haven't got a message that we're communicating, then we shouldn't be doing it. We shouldn't be imaging on social media any human remains. And I can tell you some high-profile historians who I think have a long, dirty track record of just promoting themselves and promoting their subject by just showing human remains. Here's some human remains. Here's a mummy. Isn't it ghoulish? 100 likes, 25, 40 retweets. More followers. Watch my latest TV program. Here's me with a skull. It's shameful, absolutely shameful. And I think Thompson and Eriksson make the points of permission, respect, justification, education are the ways forward. But I think there's some further things I'd like to say on this topic relating to the potential challenges we have, because it's not just about what we do; it's about the audiences that we encounter. And Ellen Finn says rightly that we've got to challenge these misuses of human remains when they're used and abused, but it's often context is lost. And the Herculaneum example, but also the Anglo-Saxon cemetery at Oakington example, a photograph that was taken during excavation showing a skeleton that actually it showed remarkable survival despite a pipe going through it, and it looked like a violent intervention. The body had been sliced through with this pipeline. And everyone got outraged. Look at the destruction. Why aren't archaeologists stopping this? It's the archaeologists' fault and the developers' fault. But actually, it was a positive story of how little damage had been done by a pipeline that had been carefully placed through the ground by laser and technology, so they didn't have to dig a trench to put the pipe in. They sort of fed it through. How little damage it did, and they didn't even know the graves were going to be there. But it's very easy for the images of the dead to promote outrage, both human disrespect, but also outrage. How dare you show this? How dare you do that? And I think one of the things I want to get out of this is, and this links to what Finn says in a 2018 conversation piece, is that we should be about death positivity, of using human remains as an opportunity to convey positive educational stories about the past. So it's not necessarily about denouncing the use of images and being outraged, but making sure that we use this as an opportunity. And if we see people making mistakes, or we shouldn't necessarily call them out to denounce them, but use it as an opportunity to explain and to provide context ourselves, and to use this as an opportunity to reflect on why we're doing what we're doing. Now, I've pulled my punches online with this. Both I have seen field archaeology pictures of students digging skeletons immediately put online from the day it happened, and I thought to myself, I don't really think that's on. And I haven't made an issue of it because I don't want it to be about outrage and denouncing that field team. I certainly don't want those students to be the focus of my ire, and the project in particular is the focus of my criticism. I've seen funerary monuments, early medieval funerary monuments, treated as jokes online. And that's fine if there's then a follow-up context explaining what they are, but they weren't in this particular context. So I think we all have lessons to learn. I'm not saying I am a pure as driven snow in this regard. I've interacted with tombs, used humour in social media posts, and done blog posts which put me into the picture. So it's not about me being right and other people being wrong, but it's about thinking about these issues and having a conversation. If we see things we don't agree with, we can point them out, but not necessarily by saying, Professor Howard Williams has shared an image online, I'm outraged, how dare he, let's unfollow him, let's everything he's ever done is probably transphobic and racist, and which, it's more about using that as an opportunity to say, okay, why are we doing what we're doing? How do we do it better? How do we move this forward? And without guidelines, I think that more positive, death positive construction of a discussion around how we share the human remains is perhaps the best way forward, reflecting on our own past practice as well as those of our colleagues, and saying, you know what's not okay, you know what is okay, but perhaps you need to better explain the context so that people can follow up the information. I think that's the way forward. I mean, take something like a 3D visualization site like Sketchfab. There's loads of funerary monuments on there, but very few of them have detailed descriptions explaining what they are. My blog, however, will, but sometimes maybe I just use a generic image, and that's not good enough. I need to explain what that image is there for. So we've got to think about our practice and think about improving how we image the dead. But it's going to happen anyway, and there's a flood of images out there, so it's not necessarily about us worrying about our practice, but about being active commentators on what everyone else is doing, be critical, but also fair, and use the opportunity to explain why there might be an issue of showing a photograph of a Peruvian mummy without any context, just to get clicks, just for the clickbait. So we are justified by who we are if we're professionals and we're using it for education, but it's not just about what we do, it's about going beyond what we do and not necessarily just calling out, but drawing attention and using in a kind way the opportunities of professional archaeologists and others to sharing human remains to further the conversation about how we do this. And I think Erikson and Thompson's chapter in the new book on the ethics of displaying human remains in a global context is really a good starting point. And it's the while Williams and Atkins in 2015, our paper, sort of set up the broader context, they take it forward in a very clear and structured way, saying that we need to think about permissions. You shouldn't be taking pictures if you don't have permission anyway. Respect, justification and educational context of why you're doing it in particular. But I will also expand that and say that we need to think about this not just in terms of human remains, but mortuary monuments, funerary architectures, landscapes. And we also need to think about it in terms of not just educational context, but death positive context, of ways in which we can use this to be more than just educate about the past, but educate or enlighten and reflect and foster contemplation and perhaps even therapy as well as education using human remains. And sometimes I would caution them, that's not just about being light of touch. It's not simply about being sensitive. Sometimes we should shock using human remains. Perhaps we should surprise people in our use of human remains. And if there's context to allow that to happen in an artistic or a scientific and educational context, then that should be allowed too. But how we do it is going to obviously be very careful, and we will make mistakes, but it's about having that kind and open conversation rather than that sort of denouncing culture that will allow us to get better at doing this. Because we don't want to stop sharing images of any funerary context, but we do want to be careful and cautious and respectful about how we do it. Now, I hope you have lots of views of your own on this issue, and I've only touched on some of the key points, and I look forward to hearing some feedback. Do subscribe to my YouTube channel. Do get in touch via the comments below. Give me your views. And I hope this fosters a debate, and maybe I'll come back to this topic. I also should say I'll put links in the descriptor below to some of my blog posts that address this topic, and the open access article from 2015 I mentioned on blog bodies, looking at and how we blog about digital mortuary archaeology, but also some of the other issues. Thank you.
For relaxing times, make it Archaeodeath time.